today. If you're anything like me, you'll think about questions as you're going along. If you pop those in the chat if you want to, that's great. We'll probably, I think Helen and I were thinking we're best focused if we look at the questions at the end. So we might look like we're ignoring it if it comes up in the chat during, but we'll come around to the questions at the end. So pop them in as you go, and it'll be hopefully a useful session for you all. So I think we're okay to kick off now, aren't we? Are we recording? Lovely. Excellent. So we are both from the evidence-based practice team, and for those who find a headquarters a bewildering array of different departments and directorates, we're based in the insights team. And one of the things that the evidence-based practice team, one of the key things we do is we summarise the latest and the best published research relevant to practice in prison, probation and youth custody. So we work across the board really. And our aim is to bring together things into something that's accessible and relevant, such as evidence summaries that we produce. And we'll be talking about the evidence summary that we wrote for this subject area throughout today's session. And we'll talk a little bit more about evidence summaries at the end. We also, in our jobs, support and consult staff and colleagues, as well as undertake research ourselves, all with the goal to broaden our understanding of issues. A little bit of background about me. I'm Kate Netten, and prior to joining this team a couple of years ago, I was a probation officer for about 15 years. And introducing my colleague.
Hi everyone, it's so lovely to see so many of you on the call today. My name's Helen Wakeling. I am a research psychologist. I've been working in the service for about 20 years now. Before joining this team, I worked predominantly looking at the research around the interventions delivered in both prison and probation. So that's my background.
Excellent, thanks Helen. So what we're going to be covering today, well, as I mentioned, our evidence summary will give you a little bit of a background about why we were asked to do it and what we did, and to pull out some of those key areas of interest for you all, we'll be looking at the risk factors for sexual reconviction. What do we know about those who are reconvicted for sexual offences? What might be helpful to look out for? We'll also be covering resettlement and reintegration after prison, and then we'll look at what good looks like when managing people who are sentenced for sexual offences. And at the end, I'll be drawing your attention to a paper that Hazel Kemshall wrote a couple of years ago on risk and assistance, which I found really helpful. So we just thought we'd just bring that up to your attention because it pulls together quite a lot of the things that we talk about today quite nicely. So the evidence summary, it was commissioned by the sex offending policy team, and the initial focus that they asked for us to look at was to look at serious further offences in sexual offending. So we got cracking, and what we found was that the research frequently didn't actually provide us enough detail about the kind of threshold. And as we know, working in England and Wales, for something to qualify as a serious further offence, it's got to be quite a specific offence to take place. And the research was just frequently talking about sexual reoffending more generally. So we realised we weren't able to sort of be confident as to what level it was talking about. It also meant that we weren't too sure about those cases which might have been plea bargained down but could be seen as a serious further offence, or some that actually kind of stopped in their tracks, as it were, but were well on their way to being a serious further offence. And we felt that we weren't probably getting a full enough picture. So we broadened our search to sexual reoffending and reconviction while subject to supervision, and that was something we were able to focus our search in. When we say raised risk in this context, it's because the person will have had a previous conviction for sexual offence, so that's what we mean there. Practitioners, I think there's quite a few practitioners that are joining us today, which is great. You might have a certain person that you're working with at the moment that's in your head that you're sort of looking for some answers for. I definitely would have been very similar if that's the case. Or it might be someone that you've worked with in the past that comes to mind as we're going through this. Obviously, this isn't a case formulation. This is a much broader brush, but we're hoping that this is going to be useful just to be aware of what the evidence tells us. As Helen will cover in a little bit, the evidence is developing and the quality is quite mixed, so we'll highlight that for you as well. It's really important that we're not prescriptive, as we might miss things. So, for example, one of the papers that we found was a review on the toxic trio. For those of you who are familiar with it or not, toxic trio was three sort of risk factors: substance misuse, domestic abuse, and mental health. And the review of the evidence found that despite that term's prevalence in social care, there was actually little quality evidence to support it. And this resulted in oversimplifying parental risk in policy and practice. It had actually become quite self-reinforcing, and other factors were ignored or treated as merely contextual. Whilst it wasn't saying that these three factors aren't important risk issues, obviously they are going to be. It was more about how the dominance of the trio became embedded in routine and processes and practices and data collecting and reporting and professional mindsets, and it meant losing attention of other factors. So we're really conscious that we want to learn from this. So we don't want to be really prescriptive in what we tell you that we found in the papers that we looked through. Risk, as we know, is really complicated, and I always love an analogy. And the reason I've got that bike padlock there on the screen is I listen to, and I'm a bit of a fan of podcasts, as you'll probably realise as we go on. And there was a great crime podcast, and it was talking about risk as a lock, a combination lock. And if you think about it as each number on that lock to reach the sort of combination to unlock the offending behaviour could be a different factor. So the first number could be something like gender, the second one could be age, the third one could be something like number of previous convictions. And each of those would have to come in place along with some other ones which are going to be very unique to that individual in order for that offending to be unlocked. The reason I'm saying that is that although men convicted of sexual offences are proportionately more likely than those convicted of other offences to reoffend sexually, the vast majority of new sexual assaults are not committed by those subject to the sex offender register. So Helen, let's get started. Do we need to throw out all the things that we thought that we knew out of the window? What would be fine in terms of some of the classic risk factors we may think of in terms of sexually reoffending?
Thanks, Kate. No, we definitely don't want to throw anything out the window or anything that we thought we knew before out the window. So we read a lot of papers as part of this review. And what we found is that many of the risk factors, the static and dynamic risk factors that we'll all be familiar with for those of us working in this area, are all very relevant. So we know that the best risk factors for sexual reoffending are the ones that we'll all be quite familiar with. Things like the dynamic risk factors. So when we talk about dynamic risk factors, we're talking about things that can be amenable to change. So perhaps through intervention or over time. But the dynamic risk factors, which we seem to be the best risk factors for sexual reoffending, are still things like sexual preoccupation, sexualized violence, having offence supportive attitudes, the presence of intimacy deficits, having kind of negative social influences, perhaps having impulsivity or poor problem solving. So all of these things are all really important. But as part of our review, we found a number of research studies which focused on, like, retrospectively examining the characteristics of men who carried on with their sexual offending. And this body of evidence, there's quite a number of studies we looked at, as I've said, but this kind of evidence pointed to quite a few emerging characteristics or more commonly found characteristics of people who persist in sexual offending. Although we need to be clear that not everyone with these characteristics that we mentioned will go on to commit further offences, but they were more likely to have these kind of characteristics. And I guess many of them on this slide will be really familiar to you. But there may be some that are less so, and some of the findings as we go through this slide pack again might be things that you haven't perhaps come across from the literature. So the body of evidence suggested that risk factors, so static risk factors, which are those that and not amenable to change, so they're quite fixed factors, include age. So people convicted of sexual offences who are over the age of 50 seem to be less likely to reoffend than younger people, which makes sense. Those people who commit further offences tend to be younger in age, and that makes sense in terms of our risk, all that we know about risk assessment. But there are differences in age by offence type too, when we're thinking specifically about sexual offences. So sexual recidivism seems to be highest in the youngest age categories for those who've committed incest or rape, whereas for those who've committed extrafamilial child offences, sexual recidivism seems to remain at a similar level until about the mid-40s, and then it seems to decline. We know that criminal history is a really important static risk factor for sexual reoffending. So those with people with more than one sexual offence conviction have recidivism rates that are higher than those who just have one sexual conviction. So those with more previous convictions are more likely to reoffend. Research also shows that people with a history of convictions for things like wounding, robbery, arson, kidnapping, cruelty to children, and minor sexual assaults. These things are also risk indicators for further serious sexual assaults. So having some of these convictions in someone's history are maybe things to look out for. And a considerable proportion of men convicted of sexual offences, particularly those actually convicted of rape, have been found in a number of studies to have a history of burglary. So some of you will have undoubtedly seen this, but this history of burglary came out as in a number of different studies that we observed from this review. Victim characteristics are also important. So what you see from the literature is that people who have a stranger victim and people with a male victim tend to have greater sexual reoffending rates. There are certain things around specific offence characteristics as well. So some studies that look at particular characteristics about particular offences indicate, for example, that those who go on to commit further sexual offences may be more likely to be intoxicated at the time of the offence than those committing other types of further offences. High levels of childhood adversity. Yeah, this came out quite a lot in the literature as well. So there's increasing evidence that people who commit the most serious and violent offences are really quite highly likely to have experienced severe and multiple traumatic events during their childhood. So they might have been bullied. You might see a history of physical abuse in childhood. There may be a history of family dysfunction, victimization, and post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So those are some of the static factors. Some of the dynamic risk factors that kind of emerged from this review included an antisocial orientation. So there was quite a large meta-analysis that we looked at, and in that the antisocial orientation was the major predictor of all forms of recidivism amongst people convicted of sexual offences. And researchers also found that people who offend against women who recidivated were characterised by a kind of early onset of criminal activity and by escalation in their antisocial and criminal activities from childhood to adolescence. Personality disorder also kind of came out in the literature. People with a personality disorder, it seems to be associated with a greater likelihood for recidivism. In one study that we looked at, which examined serious further offences in London probation, the prevalence of personality disorder was higher in the group who committed serious further offences and significantly predicted sexual recidivism, which was quite interesting. adult relationships, so sexual recidivists have higher rates of relationship instability. Offence-related sexual interests, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anyone, but a number of studies identified this specific offence-related sexual interest and paraphilias as kind of a key factor associated with people who sexually recidivated. The sexual offender register, so the evidence suggested that the vast majority of new sexual assaults are actually not committed by those subject to the sex offender register. And finally on here we've got opportunity. So in some cases it seems like sexual reoffending looks like it's the result of opportunity that people have to offend. And this is observed particularly amongst those who sexually offend against victims of different ages. So it tends to be seen in those with a history, including offences against teenage victims, so those aged between 11 and 14.
So if we're thinking of a good risk assessment, looking at background factors, establishing what's changeable to monitor and identifying areas of support. So that's all sort of things that we're probably quite familiar with in our work. So what did we find out about the people who went on to be reconvicted for sexual offences?
So what we found is that there are differences in reconviction rates between sexual offence types. So people with different types of sexual offences have different propensities to offend. So we see generally higher rates of reconviction are found amongst those who offend against male children and strangers. I think I've already mentioned that. But we also see lower rates amongst those who offend against female children and those who offend against people within their family. However, I think we should remember that most people who are convicted of a sexual offence do not reoffend sexually. The sexual reoffending rate is really low, so we should remember that, and that more of this group recidivate with a non-sexual rather than a sexual offence actually.
Are there any particular time periods to be aware of?
So the studies that we found in this review indicate that sexual reoffending seems to be highest in the first 12 months post-sentence or release from prison. So this comes from really two studies particularly. So one of these, in one of the studies, half of the sample who recidivated did so within 9 months. And in the other study, the average time to reoffend was 15 months. So what we're looking at is probably around the first year is the kind of riskiest time for people, it seems.
So I'm a bit confused. I think I always thought that sexual reconviction tended to be years later.
So overall, the longer people are in the community, offence-free, so living in the community without offending, the less likely they are to reoffend. So some of you might be familiar with the old risk assessment tool we used to use, the RM2000. Within that, there was a rule that if people had been living in the community offence-free for a certain number of years, then they would reduce a risk category, because that's what the evidence tells us in terms of kind of reducing risk. But we also have to remember that the numbers are small. So as I said previously, sexual reoffending rates are very low. So Kate, yeah, there will be some people who recidivate years later, but according to the research, we found a greater proportion seem to reoffend sooner in that first year period.
Okay, so was there anything about the type of offences? Do people tend to stick to the same type of offences if they do reoffend?
The majority of people who commit sexual offences seem to target a specific type of victim. And this is particularly the case with those people with non-contact sexual offences. And actually crossover between sexual offence types is quite rare for those with adult contact offences and those with non-contact sexual offences, although there is sometimes crossover for those with child contact offences, then reoffending with an indecent image offence. But there is also research suggesting that a kind of sizable proportion of this population, so a sizable number of men convicted of sexual offences, do have victims that span multiple age groups, and this is more likely in people with adolescent victims. But what we see from the evidence is that persistent offending is not really likely to switch from, it does happen, but it's not likely to switch from male to female victims. It's much more likely to vary in the nature of the sexual act the perpetrator is performing or doing, and also the victim's age. But again, I think it's important to reiterate the fact that people committing sexual offences don't always limit themselves to sexual offences, and this is particularly true for those who are convicted of rape. So people with an antisocial tendency, which we're more likely to see in people committing rape, are more likely to show a greater versatility in their offending, so a wider range of types of offences across age groups as well.
So what about everyone's worst nightmare then? What about escalation?
Well, fortunately, it's actually quite rare, and when it does happen, the research suggests that the most supported risk factor for escalation is this general clustering of antisocial behaviour, including having a history of sexual and non-sexual convictions. So, for example, for those people who escalate from an exhibitionist offence, for example, so people who escalate from that into a contact sexual offence, which actually is quite rare, so only a small percentage, only about 5 to 10% of those people committing exhibitionist offences actually escalate to a contact offence. But for those who do, there does seem to be, what we see is this kind of general clustering of antisocial behaviour and a history of sexual and non-sexual convictions. And in another study which we looked at, it compared recidivists who had escalated from non-contact offending to contact offending, and they tended to be younger at their first offence. They tended to have greater levels of offence-related sexual interest. They tended to have a greater history of childhood victimisation and more non-violent past offences. So you can see from what I've just said that a lot of the factors that we were talking about before kind of can cluster together to make it more likely for someone to go on to commit a further offence or to escalate in the seriousness of their offending.
Gosh. Did the research point to things that could help to look out for when we're managing someone during their sentence?
Yes, so 2 things particularly stood out for us in the research. And the first was periods of stress or change. So as with all of us, in times of stress or periods of change and uncertainty, we're probably not likely to be at our best. So then it makes sense then, I guess, that in periods of stress or change, we might then see a deterioration in people's behaviour, and decision making as well might deteriorate. So in one study we looked at how someone was adjusting to being on licence, so to that period of change of being on licence, that could actually predict recidivism in the future.
I suppose that makes sense. I'm thinking about from when I was practicing, some things we might know about. So if somebody lost their accommodation and they were at some sort of supported housing, and then we got a call from the key worker to say they were evicted, we'd know big change and that's happened. But sometimes there are going to be things we might not be aware of. It could be that someone might be consciously holding something back, but it might be that it is unconscious. They might not be able to communicate about it, or they might not think it's relevant.
Yes, that's a really good point. But what the evidence seemed to suggest to us that there might be some behaviours that we could specifically look out for. So the literature mentions things like people withdrawing from relationships, people isolating themselves or starting to behave in a perhaps an unusual manner or different to how they usually are. And as we know, I guess multi-agency work can really help with this. So talking with other people who are working with the person who might notice a change, for example, would be really useful to do.
What about in custody?
Yeah, so this was really interesting. So yeah, there is research that tells us that how someone behaves in prison is also really important for when we're supervising them in the community. So, for example, sexual misconduct in prison has been identified as a significant risk indicator for new sexual arrests in the community. So knowing about someone's behaviour in prison can be really important for us to help us better manage people in the community. And there was one really helpful research paper that we found, which was small scale, but it was really interesting. The study tried to identify whether behaviour in prison could predict risk and reoffending and release. So the researchers wanted to know whether ongoing and persistent behaviour in prison could be a valuable source of information. And they created a monitoring tool called Advisor, which looked at things like who the person is hanging out with, visits, their behaviour with staff, their behaviour with other residents, any hobbies that they might have, and also kind of trying to identify behaviours of concern. So officers were asked to fill this out, and behaviours were kind of monitored across the prison. And what the researchers found was that kind of lower level coping behaviours seem to be indicative of community behaviours. And so the frequency of behaviours that negative behaviours that were seen in prison could contribute to a risk probability when they're out in the community. So it's a small study and we can't really generalise from that at the moment, but what I think it does show us is that there could be ways of capturing these behaviours perhaps in a more structured way than we currently might do, but it also highlights the potential importance in doing so and passing this information on to those supervising people in the community.
Yeah, that sounds like it could be really helpful. So what do we know about resettlement back into the community after they've been in prison? Is there anything that particularly stands out in the research that we should be prioritising?
There weren't any big surprises in this area. So things like employment, accommodation, social support, family support and identity were all areas that were highlighted to be extremely important for people when they're resettling into the community. So employment, yeah, was really, employment probably stood out the most. And in one study from the States, they were basically comparing a group of people who were employed at the end of their supervision compared to people who were not employed, and those who were employed did much better, and they were much less likely to have their license revoked, and it was much less likely that they would recidivate as well. So these things are really important. I think we'll all be familiar with the topics up on this slide, but family involvement was also, I guess, came out as being particularly important for men convicted of sexual offences transitioning back into the community, and particularly for young people as well.
You did a study yourself, Helen, when you talked to people who'd been recalled to custody after they'd been convicted of sexually reoffending. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, so it was a few years ago now, but I interviewed a number of men who'd returned to prison following a sexual reoffence. So they'd been in prison, come out, sexually reoffended, and then back inside prison. And that's when I was talking to them. And one of the key findings from this study was about this, the importance of not labelling people. So how labelling people as sexual offenders was actually really damaging for them and made it harder for people when they were released from prison to build an identity that wasn't linked to their offending, so to build a non-offending identity, which we know is really important for desistance. But the group I spoke to also had a number of difficulties with accommodation, with sorting out their finances, with gaining kind of employment, but there were also big issues around loneliness and isolation amongst the group. So lots of them had been isolated from their friends and family and didn't have that kind of social support to turn to. The research was also focused on how they experience interventions on their initial sentence, which was quite interesting, because they'd all attended a programme on their initial sentence and spoke about the fact that at the time they were just kind of going through the motions of the programme and doing it because it was a requirement of their sentence rather than actually being motivated to want to learn and change. So the research, it was a very interesting project to do, but it highlighted the importance of motivation to change, to engage in programmes, but also the importance of kind of follow-up care, and the importance of social support, and all of these kind of factors came into it actually. The importance around focusing on these resettlement factors that we know are really, really critical for people's desistance.
Gosh, yeah. So let's start drawing this a little bit together. During the summary together, we, as you can imagine, there was a wealth of information. We tried to pull out some of the key bits that was helpful for us. And we've got a lot more detail, which is in the evidence summary, which we'll be talking about in a second. I think I've seen a few questions coming up. So there is an evidence summary that we've pulled this all together. But the key bits that came through for us was the strengths-based approach, so sticking with that, planning for a positive life, as well as good planning for risk management, focusing on those reintegration factors, particularly that Helen was just mentioning there, and including getting people into suitable employment and helping them to maintain it, getting people onto the right treatment and interventions which target their risk, need factors, attending to needs around substance misuse, mental health needs and personality disorder, using risk and needs assessment that are validated for the people being assessed and then reassessing later, because as we've mentioned, things change. Observing behaviour in different settings, so using that good multi-agency communication can really help there. And that really important bit, obviously, of listening to the person being supervised. Another key bit that we really need to hold on to, and I'm so aware of how overwhelming it can be at the moment, particularly being a probation practitioner, but it's ensuring that practitioners have the right support, both formal and informal, and tools to be able to do the job. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a particular paper that could be quite helpful. And I think that if you look on that previous slide, it's all familiar, but that can feel blooming overwhelming, can't it? It's that real balancing act that practitioners have of that risk and public protection, and as well as reintegration and rehabilitation. There was a recent article that came out earlier this year by Toby, Blagden and Winder, and it analysed the experiences of 12 men with sexual convictions seeking employment, and it had the title, which I loved, which is "It's okay if you were in for robbery or murder, but sex offending, that's a no-no." And that article, it highlighted the particular challenges that people have if there's a sexual conviction. And we know how important employment is upon release from prison, not just because it provides people with some basic financial stability, but it's also got that opportunity to reduce social isolation and gain that sense of purpose and satisfaction. But getting the opportunity for the job can be a real challenge if they have a conviction for sexual offending. So as a practitioner, how can we balance all this? How can we incorporate this into our day-to-day practice, the public protection side, as well as supporting rehabilitation? Kemshall's article I really like. It's not too dense if you do get a moment to be able to read any articles if you are a practitioner and pretty blooming busy, but it's a really great read. And what she talks about is protective integration. So identifying practical ways practitioners can balance desistance approaches with that public safety in the probation practice. She talks about supportive authority, so setting those expectations and encouraging positive choices, as well as signalling disapproval or applying legitimate sanctions for risky behaviours and negative conduct. It's important that we understand how people frame risk choices themselves. So what we as practitioners may see as risky, the individual may perceive as rewarding, or it's habitual, or just part of self-identity. So it's reframing those cost benefits of risky behaviour with constant reinforcement can help. If we're building strengths and we want to mitigate that thing that we're hearing a lot about at the moment, the pain of desistance, that desisting from crime can be painful. For example, a lack of acceptance from others due to the person trying this new pro-social identity, or if they fail to achieve a pro-social goal, that could be a real, it could feel even harder. So this can prevent people getting rid of that offender label and stigma and prevent their reintegration into communities. So personal support, praise, and just simply walking alongside the person can help. Kemshall talks about supporting bonding capital, which is securing and reinforcing belonging, and then something called bridging capital, which is enabling access to new groups, networks, and opportunities. So we could be thinking about things there like circles of support and accountability. This can be challenging, and particularly when there are concerns at risk. And we see this even more so probably when it's people convicted of sexual offences. She suggests a critical question, which I've put in bold there because I loved it. And I just think it's a really just straightforward question that we can ask ourselves. How can this be done safely? What could be put in place to make it safer and more acceptable for both the person on probation and that community? She also highlights the importance of enhancing resilience and combating fatalism. So people who desist from crime have been found to see themselves as capable of influencing their own actions and the environment they're in. Whereas those who have persistently have offended, they've been found to see themselves as victims of circumstance or unable to influence actions or events, seeing themselves more helpless in it all. So the practical skill building can help people to successfully manage risky situations without reoffending and promote resilience. So one of the things we always do when we do our evidence summaries is we always ask the question, what do we not know? And there are lots of gaps. So, this is not, this is a to be continued, I suspect, and more research will be coming out all the time. We were unable to find research specifically focusing on other protected characteristics such as gender. So the majority of all the papers we could find, almost all of them, I think, Helen, wasn't it, were about males. We couldn't find anything on race and ethnicity or disability and sexuality. So those are big gaps there. One of the things I probably had my eye on, which I was really looking for, was seeing if there was anything that was addressing issues about transferring cases between probation areas or multiple changes in practitioners who are responsible for managing the individual subject to probation. And I was particularly interested in this because of the serious case reviews that are in the public domain. I noticed that quite often there would be the person had moved area, or they were seeing another practitioner after another. And, obviously it's one of those things that I think as practitioners, we all felt frustrated about. I know that the agencies that work with us get frustrated about, oh, who's holding this case? But most importantly, the person on probation, they're opening up about things and then, oh, it's another person. I think that the point that Helen highlighted about the importance of the periods of change and uncertainty, that did come up as a theme in the papers. So it could be that we could put it under that. We know that if you're changing a lot, then that's going to come under that change and uncertainty. But I just wanted to flag that up because I think it's something that we as practitioners probably get quite frustrated about. And I think it'd be really interesting if a paper did look specifically at addressing continuity of professionals or the impact of change in supervisory relationships. I think that would be smashing. So it doesn't mean it's not there, it just doesn't appear to be sort of explicitly pulled out. Many of the studies that we read relied on case records, interviews with professionals, or data collection such as reconviction rates. And there was surprisingly little that we could find providing the perspective of the people who actually committed those offences and or the voice of the victims. So that was another gap. The majority of the research we found focused on those assessed as being a raised risk who go on to sexually reoffend, and less specifically on learning from those who don't. Or if they do, it's a less serious one. So stealing a chocolate bar from a shop because they felt stressed rather than sexually reoffending again. And we really felt that there could be such potential, could be in the learning that we could by going back and finding out about what happened, what went right, as it were. looking at that lock analogy, which I mentioned earlier, there could be so many moments, such as spending extra time in a particular appointment, listening, talking through, or maybe putting a call through to a partner agency, which might have prevented things escalating and we just don't know about, but could have been a key factor. And so that's just an area we thought there could be so much learning from. And just as we said about that lock analogy, everyone, how they react to certain circumstances and differences are going to be, you know, individually dependent on so many factors. There's a fable that I really love, which talks about a father who was alcoholic, he was violent, he was aggressive and abusive, and he had two sons. And one son went on to be exactly the same, alcoholic, abusive, violent, aggressive to his children. And then the other son was completely different. And both sons were asked the same question, what happened to you? And both sons gave the same answer, look at my father. Now, I'm not meaning to parent blame here. I'm a parent myself. We don't want to go down that route. But it's just interesting, isn't it, when you just think about how people can just say with the same answer, it's meant to mean so much. So I think there's a lot more that we could learn here. So we are now towards the end, and as I mentioned, evidence summaries. So some of you might be on our mailing list and will have seen these. In the left hand, we've done a screen grab of what our evidence summaries look like, just in case you wanted to see if they look familiar. I did once try to read an evidence summary in a probation open plan office, and never again. Not to diss my team and what we do. I think that we're very aware that particularly the practitioners who are going to be very busy, it's fantastic if you want to read it and look at all the research, but we also do produce an infographic. We try to aim to do a one-pager to go along with each of the evidence summaries that we produce, which pulls together some of the key points from the summary, because we're so aware of how full on it is at the moment. But for those of you who do want to have a read through, see all those articles, where they came from and things, they are our evidence summaries are they're available internally. So I think this event has been open to staff that are external as well. So unfortunately, they're only available internally, our evidence summaries, but do get in touch, and I'm sure we can try a workaround in terms of if there's particular areas that you're interested in. Drop us an email and Helen and I will get back to you and try and figure out a way that we don't give you an internal document, but that we can hopefully help with any questions. And I think that is where we're up to. So I think I saw questions flying in as we went, and I'm so sorry. It did look like we were ignoring them. We weren't at all. We've now hopefully got 10 minutes to have a look through and see where we're up to. So does anyone want to sort of put a hand out and shout out a question while we have got quite a few questions. Where do we start?
Right, I think we can start. Oh, there is a question.
Oh yes, Claire.
Claire, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, it's only a really quick one. So we manage the women's team, and I just wondered, in terms of transgender, if there's any research out there regarding this. I know you're shaking your head because that's what I thought it'd be.
Yeah, no.
Not found very much, or if anything, there's maybe one or two bits. But yeah, it would be interesting if there's anything regarding the transgender community also.
Yeah.
Sorry, Helen.
Well, sorry, Kate. I was going to say, yeah, we there was nothing that we came across in our search. And I think hopefully in the next few years there will start to be some more research on that population coming through. I'd hope so anyway. But yeah, we couldn't find any. But yeah, it's a group that we need to obviously find out more about. There is a question in the chat around whether these findings were based on just male offenders or male and female, and I think Kate did refer to that. But most of this, in fact, all of this research was based on male men convicted of sexual offences. We didn't find anything large, like robust evidence around female. So that's another.
Yeah, it's worth also mentioning that some of the papers that we read did look at quite large samples, and there just really wasn't that much detail about the sort of the participants in the research. So there might be in there, but I think we can be fairly confident we're looking mainly at male identified people that are generally, it was the adult side, but we have highlighted where we can, where it was younger people as well, because I know that is a sort of distinct group too. So is there another person who wanted to ask a question? Who was that? I can't see the name.
It might be Claire again.
Oh, hello, Claire.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm also the veteran lead, and I wondered if you'd come across any research regarding serving veterans or military veterans who have committed a sexual offence and have gone on to commit a further sexual offence, and whether it's linked to being a looked after child, etc. I know I was doing my PhD before I came to probation, and I'm now a PSO in probation. And that was one of my areas that I was looking at the time, to do with welfare provisions for ex-forces. And it came up a lot then about veterans who'd been in particular in war zones, and come across that as quite a normal cultural thing in the likes of Afghanistan, etc. And whether that's something that's cropped up in your research also.
Again, we didn't specifically look. I think if we look for that specifically, we'd find more, but it didn't come out as a specific finding. But I think many of the things that veterans might, some of the factors that might be associated or more likely to be associated with veterans, like PTSD and some of that trauma, kind of did come out, but in different kind of contexts, if you see what I mean. So I think there probably is more out there than we found, but because we weren't specifically focused on looking at that population, subpopulation, it's not included in this review.
Yeah. Rachel, I can see there was a question that you asked about the dwelling burglary. That was a question I wanted to know as well. A lot of the papers were very vague. They just said burglary, but Helen and I were involved in a call to some research that might be happening fairly soon by some team, I think it's in the Ministry of Justice, and they will be looking at, hopefully, we're going to sort of, say, can you be specific if you're looking at previous offences about, is it dwelling burglary or is it just burglary, including commercial burglary and that side? So that was something that there was a lack of clarity on in the studies that we found. I'm conscious there's another hand up and I don't know how to find that. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's Betty.
Hi, it's me. Hiya. Sorry if I have missed it. Have you had any evidence, or is there any specific areas or postcodes that have more sexual offences compared to sort of others? And is education, or a high level of education, a good deterrent for sexual offending? And then my last question is, I know it's been mentioned in the chat about these paedophile hunters. I really would like to get your opinion on that. Thank you.
Okay, so to take your first, I think there's 3 points in that question. So to take the first one about the postcodes, no, we weren't looking specifically around that. So the research that we were looking at came from, it was both UK based but also international evidence as well. And we weren't specifically looking at that issue. Education being a deterrent for sexual reoffending. Well, I think the desistance literature would suggest that people who are employed will be less likely to recidivate. And I guess education is kind of linked to employment, but people who are more involved in their in society and kind of have so being involved in an education forum or that kind of setting, I think can be helpful. But that didn't come out specifically either, I guess, as a key kind of point from the research. Do you think, Kate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm having a quick read through of the paedophile hunter questions. Is there somebody that could just who was the first person who mentioned it? Was it Rachel? Is there somebody who's able to just ask the question for the group? Because it's probably quite useful just to hear what the area is that people have been chatting about.
Hello, it's Rachel. I didn't raise it as an issue. I responded to something. I think I'm picking up, there was a debate of whether paedophile hunters were a good or bad thing in terms of recidivism. I think that's a gist, but I may have misinterpreted that. So
Oh yes, it was Ross who originally. I'm going back now in the chat.
yeah.
Ross, are you there?
Hi. Yes.
Oh,
Hi. So there was a lot of vigilante groups around my area up in Scotland, and they were targeting reoffenders that had been rehomed in the area. They weren't related to the crime in any way, but they just didn't want reoffenders living in the community. And so there was quite a lot of groups that were actively trying to get people moved if they found out about their offender status. So I was just wondering how that has been impacting like reoffender rates and things like that, if there's anything around that. I said paedophile hunters and that was the wrong group. It's like a tangent, but yeah.
Yes. Right. Yes. There definitely wasn't anything that we were in our the papers that we were looking at about that as an issue. It wasn't coming up specifically in the search terms we were looking at. It's a really interesting question though, because you'd imagine that drives people underground, and if all the research that we've been highlighting is saying the importance of reintegrating into the community and getting that pro-social identity, I can't imagine it's going to be doing any favours for that at all. But there weren't anything. There was nothing specific that came up. But once again, we didn't do a specific search for that. And I think it does obviously raise a whole kettle of mess, doesn't it?
I think it also kind of links into the labelling aspect that we kind of mentioned in the presentation around the damaging impact that labelling can have on people. And I just imagine that these kind of vigilante groups who are trying to out people as offenders I can only think that's damaging in terms of trying to reintegrate them into society and to help people to move away from their offending identity to a non-offending identity, and to support them in that process of kind of helping them with their social support and integration. So yeah, but we didn't find anything specifically on that when we were doing our searches. I hope that answers those questions.
Yes, definitely. That was very useful. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Harriet, I'm just seeing your question. I'm applying no logic to the questions I'm finding here. I apologise, and I will scroll up properly. I just saw that you were asking about if this is going to impact on reviews or ongoing development or understanding of arms assessments. Helen, you're probably the better one to answer that. But the team that actually requested this summary were the sexual offending policy team. So they are linked in absolutely everywhere. And I know that they've already asked for our evidence summary to go to the parole board as well. So that will hopefully be helping the parole board too. Helen, was there anything about arms, because you're involved in various things?
Yeah, I think the team that commissioned this I think are involved in the arms assessment, so I'm hoping that this will feed into some of the learning around that assessment, but I don't know how formally that will happen. But I think that the policy team who wanted us to do this work have been really pleased with the review and have found it really useful. So I'm hoping that they will use that in an ongoing way to kind of review some of the processes that are in place.
Yeah. Elaine asked, was the research confined to the UK, and was the diversity of the research? No, we didn't confine it to just the UK. We really wanted to make sure it was as wide a net as possible, so we could get a real sense of the picture there. I don't know if there's anything, Helen, that you'd like to add to that.
No, I don't think so. The question from Katie was around a research paper explaining about the behaviour in custody.
Yes.
I can't remember what that paper is called, but it is it's referenced in the evidence summary. So what we're going to do is we're going to send the evidence summary to everyone on this distribution list, I think, aren't we?
I hope so. Yeah, I'm not sure about the internal, external, all that things. If you accidentally get a copy of this and you're external, that will be terrible. I have to work that.
I think it's fine. We're going to share it with all of you. But for those of you who are external, if you could not forward it on to anyone else, that would be most appreciative. But for anyone internal, you can access all of our evidence summaries on the intranet, so you should be able to find them there. But we will send this to you.
Also, my sympathies on navigating the intranet. We're fully aware of how difficult that is. It is, if you are really struggling with the intranet, if you email evidence@justice.co.uk, Oh no, .gov.uk, then we will be able to send you the link, and we always make sure the link is in our signatures as well. So if you get an email from any of the evidence team, then that links you to all our evidence summaries. And we do, as a little plug, a range of evidence summaries which have all sorts of subject matters. So if you want to join our mailing list, that would be great. I think we've got to 3 o'clock, Helen.
Yes. I was just trying to read through all of the questions. If we haven't answered any, I will make sure that we do that in the chat.
On the chat. Yes.
In the chat. But thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you found that useful. And we will send on the evidence summary to you all.
Perfect. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.